Welcome to the Unlist. Today, I want to have a brief conversation about synthetic materials in perfume versus natural materials in perfume, what the benefits and the drawbacks are of each. This might be a bit of a controversial video, I guess, because you've got people who align in certain trains of thought in the fragrance community, and they'll put naturals on a pedestal, and some of that can be traced back to, well, they're fans of vintage, and vintage fragrances tend to have more naturals in them, or they're fans of artisanal perfumes, which also tend to have more naturals in them too. But the thing about naturals that you have to understand is that today's day and age, naturals have become something exclusive and rare and expensive because we as human beings have over-harvested a lot of our natural materials. So even before we discuss the advantages and the drawbacks of naturals, I kind of have to put the caveat out there that naturals tend to be given this sort of deified status. That they get sort of put up on a pedestal because the fact of the matter is, using a natural material in your perfume is a much costlier endeavor now than it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Perfume never used to be mainstream, so even the so-called mainstream brands could more cheaply and readily source natural materials, and thus there was a bit of taken for granted status, especially with materials like sandalwood, that were very plentiful and cheap imports from countries like India for a long time. But as the market grew and the demand grew, and thus the harvesting of the materials grew, we weren't really putting back what we were taking from the planet. There weren't really sandalwood farms back then. Now there are people who cultivate sandalwood. Even in like Australia, they have New Caledonian sandalwood. But for a long time, there wasn't really a need to do that since there was so much of it in nature to be found, So we kind of didn't know how good we had it in that regard. And a lot of perfumes, even like drugstore fragrances, were very rich in natural materials. But there was also the thing that they just didn't have the knowledge of chemistry, nor did they really have a very widely available palette of synthetics to use anyway, or else they would have used them. A lot of the older perfumes feel more complex and feel more opaque because they are bashing a ton of naturals together. And a lot of times, the only way to really overcome some of the drawbacks that naturals do have is to mix them together, to hide things. Classic example would be animal musks. Animal musks really stink. With the exception of like maybe Tonkin, like deer musk, a lot of animal musks, Castoreum, Heraceum, Civet, they smell terrible. So the workaround is building a fragrance on top of them to hide the bad facets and bring out the good ones. A lot of modern perfumers who do not have the experience with these natural musks and materials find them shockingly difficult to work with because they weren't trained to overcome those drawbacks and thus don't really know how to. And of course, the perfumes having to become more complex to hide some of the deficiencies of these materials creates an aesthetic choice. People smell the old Guerlain fragrances, the old Caron fragrances, and they compliment them for how big and complex and abstract they are. But they realize that, yeah, a lot of that was an aesthetic choice, but some of it was necessity. So without a historical context to really dig into, you can get really lost in the weeds about natural materials and get an opinion of them that's factually incorrect. I mean, you're entitled to have the opinion that you have, but you want to at least have the facts, right? Before you want to have an informed opinion, correct? So that's what I'm trying to give you here, is an informed opinion. So the thing about naturals is synthetics really didn't start coming around until the dawn of the 20th century. The earliest one being like tonka, which is coumarin derived from tonka bean using nitrogen gas to extract the coumarin from the beans. And then we saw the earliest nitro musks, which were a byproduct of TNT manufacture. And the nitro musks were an alternative to the stinky poo-poo animal musks. We could use musk ketone, musk xylene in a fragrance and it had more benefits and less drawbacks than the natural musks had. So we started seeing them used. The ionones came sometime after that. And then, of course, into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we would see perfumers experimenting with things like hydroxycitronellol to create lily of the valley notes, because you can't do that naturally, so on and so forth. But the thing is, synthetics always had more of an experimental flair to them in the beginning, because you didn't really need them. It wasn't until halfway through the 20th century, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, once orris butter began getting more expensive because we're harvesting too much of it. Rose oil began getting more expensive because the rose fields just weren't large enough to cater to all the demand. Jasmine oil, same way. There was just not enough jasmine to go around. So we're like, oh, okay, geraniol. Oh, okay, hedione. Oh, okay, all these other materials that can sort of enhance dwindling amounts of naturals, enhance them. Geraniol with a little bit of rose oil, hedione with a little bit of real jasmine oil, etc., right? That's how it goes. Vetiver acetate to boost the smell of natural vetiver when you don't want to use a full dose of vetiver. Oak moss, when you want a perfume that's mossier than what you can really achieve with the material itself, you dump some vernal in it. In the 80s, some of those really big mossy perfumes were not pure oak moss. They were a lot of oak moss, yes, more than what you can have now, but then they had vernal on top of them to push the moss even further into the composition. So people don't really think about that. Polysantol, for instance, was developed as a booster because sandalwood was starting to get expensive into the 80s and 90s, and even houses like Guerlain were like, okay, well, we can't get as much Mysore for Samsara as we need, so we can put a little bit of polysantol in there. And eventually, the ratio of polysantol to Mysore began to shift until a point where it was basically all polysantol and maybe something else like javanol in there to rebalance it out without any oak moss at all, without any sandalwood at all. All vernal replaced oak moss in some perfumes. This is not a one-for-one, though. And of course, keen noses who've smelled a lot of deep vintages will know when they're being fed, ethyl vanillin versus vanilla extract. They'll know when they're being fed olive vernal versus oak moss. They'll know when they're being fed javanol, polysantol, and not pure Mysore wood. So it's like they know, okay? Average consumer, maybe not, but the trained noses know. So synthetics became less and less of a additive and more of a replacement into the 21st century. And then, of course, now we have fully synthetic perfumes. And a lot of that is, again, because naturals are just so expensive now. It's not even a matter of whether they're hard to work with or not. They just cost so much money because we've just, destroyed the planet, right? So now the advantages to naturals over synthetics is that naturals, because they're natural, are very complex materials. They have a lot more going on. When you have patchouli oil, it's not one molecule, okay? When you have oak moss tincture, it's not one molecule. Sandalwood is not one molecule. None of these things are one molecule. They're all kinds of molecules. The complexity of the natural oil, the essential oil, the concrete, whatever it is, however it's presented, means that in a lot of cases, you can wear the oil by itself, and it's almost its own perfume. It's almost its own complex bouquet. And trust me, in ancient times, they did that. In ancient times, before there was any abstract modern perfumery, people would wear just sandalwood oil. People would wear just oud. People would wear just lavender oils, right? Because they are complex. A lot of people don't truly know the smell of real lavender because they've only smelled soaps and candles and shampoos and things. And those are all molecular, or they're fractioned. They're not the full material. We've used chemistry to isolate certain aspects and boost others. So a lot of people don't know what real full sandalwood oil smells like. All you've got to do, if you don't have a sandalwood grower nearby, if you don't have some kind of head shop nearby, you can get a tiny, tiny bit. It doesn't have to be Mysore sandalwood oil. It can be something else. It can be, New Caledonian or whatever, but just get yourself some real oil and sniff it. Lavender is the same way. If you don't have lavender fields nearby, you don't have lavender growers, you can go to a head shop. Usually there'll be some kind of lavender essential oil there. Could be cheap, could be low grade or whatever, but it'll get the job done. It'll give you the knowledge you need to know what real, lavender smells like in its full complexity. Now, the downside to that is what I mentioned earlier. The complexity of these materials makes them hard to combine. So it takes a lot more materials to counteract some of the negatives of these other materials, like hiding the civet paste, for instance. So they're very difficult to work with. Now, the other thing about naturals, too, is that because they're natural, they're grown from the earth, is you can't always control the quality from batch to batch like you can with synthetics. So in the old days, they would do a thing where they create what's called communels. And communels were these combined batches of multiple years worth of a material. So that way the smell would shift much more slowly. Rather than being a different smell from batch to batch, you could have it a gradual shift. So like 10 years worth of production would smell relatively the same. At least that material, not the perfume it goes into, mind you, but just the material. 10 years of producing that material, very little variation. They still do communels for some naturals that are used, like lavender and rose and such. Places that grow those materials will still create communels, and then they will bottle their oils and such from those communels. So it's still a practice that's used today, just not as much. Now, synthetics, on the other hand, their purity makes them much more dependable and much easier to work with. But then the downside is that purity makes these materials more like actual building blocks. You just don't go eating spices from a spice jar, do you? You don't just go, shoving basil down your mouth, right? That would be like, like that, right? That's what synthetics are like. You can't really enjoy a 100% ISOE super. It's going to smell like rubbing alcohol. You're not going to be able to enjoy 100% ambroxan without some kind of dilution. It's just going to smell like a chemical to you. It's not going to have any link to nature that you can relate to. So synthetics, even though they are pure and thus more consistent and easier to combine, they are not enjoyable in and of themselves. You can dilute some of them down to a really low percentage. You can do really low dilutions of ambroxan, of ISOE super, cashmere, and enjoy those. They're not going to be as enjoyable to you as, say, sandalwood oil would be or patchouli oil would be, but you can dilute them, effectively making a one material perfume with alcohol, and you can enjoy them somewhat or layer them over something, right? But some of these materials, like Kalone or the various violet ionones, no, you can't enjoy those really in their natural state. They're just going to smell like, like chemicals. They're going to smell like what they are. So synthetics are really only useful as building blocks for something bigger, which leads us to the false conception that synthetics are inferior to naturals because of the way they are used in a lot of mainstream perfumery. That is not the material's fault. That is capitalism, that is corporatism, that is greed. A lot of these perfumers can and have made very soft, diffuse, complex fragrances entirely out of naturals. Look at Synthetic Jungle by Editions de Parfum Frederic Malle. Look at Beyond Paradise by Estee Lauder. Calice Becker made it a point to create a very beautiful award-winning perfume entirely out of synthetics. Mathilde Laurent, before she went off to join Cartier, one of the things that she did at Guerlain was synthetics and exploring the complex creations that could be had with synthetics. So yes, you can make beautiful, quality smelling, abstract, diffuse, soft, plush, full perfumes entirely out of synthetic materials, but you got to know what you're doing, and you got to be given the budget and the time to actually do it. So when you have all these nickel dime briefs coming down from the big designer boys, all of these bang them out by Friday, I need a copy of this fragrance, I need these materials overdosed because our consumer testing shows us that people like these materials, and you get stuff like Phantom and you get stuff like Sauvage, and you're like, oh, synthetics are cheap and they're harsh. That is not true. The formulas that those synthetic materials comprise are cheap, because they only have like 6 materials in them. And even though you can bash 6 naturals together and get a nice full perfume, you can't really bash 6 synthetics together and get a full nice perfume. You really do have to use them like brick and mortar, okay? You have to build the house. See, it's like, let me make an analogy for you. Naturals is like a cave in a rock wall. You can go into that cave, you can door it off or something and have a natural house in that cave. You may not have the best ventilation or any like electricity or anything, but you can have a shelter in that cave, naturally formed. It's there, it's complex, there's all kinds of stuff, stalagmites, stalactites, knock yourself out. It's a naturally formed cave. It can be your shelter as is. That's natural materials. Synthetic materials, it's like, oh, well, I've got all these bricks laying here, I've got nails, I've got wood beams, I've got shingles, but it's a big pile of trash laying on the floor because you haven't built a house out of it yet. You have to get a contractor to come in, drop a blueprint for you, build your house, then you can move in. That's synthetic materials in a nutshell. You can build really beautiful, amazing things out of synthetic materials. I mean, look at the Empire State Building, okay? Look at a lot of wonderful architecture. Very little natural is found in those buildings. I mean, you might have some stone facade or something, but that's all synthetic. The glass, the metal frames, synthetic, okay? Perfumes are no different, guys, no different. You can do amazing, wonderful things with synthetics if you are given the time, the R&D budget, and there's interest in doing so. And that's the problem. There really isn't interest in doing that. We want these very woody, amber heavy men's fragrances that smell like sandpaper. We want these really super high ethyl maltol bubblegum smelling women's fragrances that smell like bubblegum and raspberry, because the clients are putting these briefs out that say we want it to be fast and cheap and have these materials because we know people will buy these. And that's what happens. It is not the materials to blame here, because you could very well build a similar fragrance out of naturals. It'd be more difficult to make like a bubblegum raspberry fragrance out of naturals, but you could probably do it. You could also build a very sharp, citrusy, abrasive, sandpapery kind of like blue fragrance out of naturals. You could probably do it. It'd be a lot more hard though. It'd be a lot more difficult, but you could probably do it. It's just not cheap and not cost effective to do it. So the blame, once again, just like with, why are all the vintage fragrances so more artistic than all the modern ones in the mainstream, right? Once again, it's like back to that video. As I said, vintage fragrances in the mainstream were more interesting than they are now. It's the same thing. Synthetics and synthetic fragrances, if they're coming from the mainstream outlets, feel very dystopian and very, very, very terrible to the nose because they are so cost optimized. And they're so optimized based on demographics and consumer testing and They are soulless. It is not the materials to blame here. It's not the perfumers to blame here. It's the corporate suits, suit and tie guys. It's the accountants. Those are the ones you got to go after. So synthetics and naturals both have their advantages and their drawbacks. It's all about the chef you have in the kitchen and the amount of time the chef is given to make you that wonderful meal. You've seen many videos, I'm sure, on YouTube where you've got an expensive, like 5-star chef using regular grocery store items, and he makes an amazing meal. And then you've got someone who doesn't really know how to cook, who's thrown into like a Michelin star restaurant to make a meal out of expensive ingredients and ends up being terrible, right? So there again, it's not what you have, it's how you use it. So that really is the discussion around synthetics versus naturals, is both have their place and both can be beautiful in different ways, used differently. Clearly, naturals have the advantage in terms of out of the box. Naturals smell better out of the box. Synthetics require more work to smell better. But we can't really rely on naturals now because of what we've done to the planet and due to the cost. And there are some things that are just not possible with naturals, that are only possible with synthetics. So there's a bit of a balancing act here. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. That's my take on synthetics versus naturals. If you agree or agree to disagree, that's fine. But that's it. You have a good one.